I don't think that young people, especially in later days in junior high school, maybe even earlier than that, are taught enough to think about what they want and how they would go about getting it. And I mean what they want in a deep sense, like how their friendships could be better, how their relationships with their parents could be better, how their life could be better, practically speaking. So we tried to design a program to help younger people do the self-authoring program, but my health interfered with that, and it fell by the wayside, unfortunately. But it's helpful for people to take stock of themselves and to chart a course. And I don't think our education system does a very good job of helping people develop a vision of themselves, a story for themselves. And it's a problem because it also means that they're not ennobled or encouraged the way they should be. And I've seen this all constantly during my lectures, that people are so happy to be encouraged. They're often met with skepticism instead, and I think that's part of the problem with what's happening in our culture politically too, is that, there's this terrible critique of our culture, that all its institutions are fundamentally predicated on arbitrary power, the exercise of arbitrary power. And that implies that the ambitions of people who wish to join that culture and to thrive are expressions of tyrannical, oppressive, arbitrary power. It's very demoralizing to young people. And I don't believe it's true, because I don't think the fundamental motivation is to exploit others. I think that people who do that fail, generally speaking, often precipitously. Societies that organize themselves around that principle are miserable and collapse. They're full of deceit and backstabbing and distrust. It's hell. And so I think that young people are best encouraged. And that means that you actually have to sort of like them, like you're a mentor. It's like, I'm really on the side of the good in you, and I hope it manifests itself. And I think that's what trust is for, by the way. You should trust other people. Why? They can bite. Why would you trust them? Well, because it's courageous to. And that way you elicit the best from them. At least that's the best opportunity you have. You're going to get hurt sometime. You're going to get hurt distrusting too. But societies without trust are hell on earth. So
trusting
that's for sure.
Next generation, though, starts with you having it in the first place, right? That's sort of passing along those patterns. As if I don't trust anyone, I'm going to instill that in my child. Like, the world's not to be trusted.
You can try to change that, and if you know that trust is courage, that can help. Because trust can be just naivete. I trust you because I'm too foolish to know the difference. I've never been hurt. I've never encountered someone malevolent, so I'm naive. And I trust. That's not trust. That's blind faith in an environment that's been too benevolent for your own good. But trust, that's more like, we'll think the best of you to begin with and see what happens. And then if you make a mistake, we'll deal with that and we'll go back to trust. And those are stable negotiating strategies. And so young people need to be confronted with that, and then they need to be helped to chart their course. And that's hard. It takes a fair bit of individual attention because people are so complicated. I produced this other technology at self-authoring that helps people write about their past, analyze their faults and their virtues, and write a plan for the future. It's a useful way of figuring out who you are. You kind of have to hit yourself against the world, but you tell the story about your past, and that helps you understand where you came from. You figure out your virtues and your faults. That sort of helps you understand your strengths and weaknesses. And then a plan gives you a course for the future. It's hard to do all that writing, but it's hard to blunder through life too without a plan. So it's hard either way.
Pick your hard. You always talk about that. Choose the difficult, or the difficult will choose you eventually, and you might not like it as much, right?
Yeah, well, when it's necessary, like I wouldn't say to go out of your way necessarily to make your life difficult, but if you have a difficult choice in front of you and it's either abandon what you should be doing or do the difficult thing, well, you're going to pay a price for abandonment. So, and I guess I would also say that to understand yourself, it's quite useful to try to not lie, because you tangle yourself up in your own lies. People think they can get away with lying, but you can't get away with falsifying the structure of the world. You're going to pay for it. I've never seen anybody get away with anything in my clinical practice. No, the other shoe always dropped. Always. And unsurprisingly, if you drop a weight on your head, above your head, like it's fine until it hits you. Yeah.
But then there's changing your mind.
Yeah, you can be wrong. That's different. That's a good point, though. It's difficult to dissociate ignorance from lying, but, you get punished when you're wrong often, but that's different, It's not like it's nothing to be ignorant, to be wrong. It's still hard on you, but it's a different kind of hard to be willfully wrong.
Responsibility, I think, is an incredible message.
Yeah, the responsibility element has been well received by people, and I think maybe that's because that message isn't being delivered as effectively as it should be. The idea that meaning is to be found in responsibility.
Yeah, you're saying it hasn't been developed. You're saying it hasn't been promoted as much.
Well, there's so much of an emphasis on rights. I mean, imagine if our culture was as dominated by discussion of responsibility as it was dominated by discussion of rights.
Gosh, right?
Completely. I mean, that's just not how it is at all.
Right.
And that's strange because your rights, in some sense, are my responsibility, and vice versa. So, right, because your accorded rights, it's distance from other people in some sense. And for them, it's the same. And so you can't have one discussion without the other. Mm-hmm. But our discussion has been very one-sided. And I think that's hard on people because it's about what you're owed.
Yeah.
And it isn't obvious to me that, I don't know, it's not like not getting what you're owed isn't annoying. It is if you feel that an injustice has been committed. But it isn't obvious to me that people find the deepest meaning in their life in getting what they're owed. I really do think that people find more significance in their life in being of utility and service to other people. That's how it looks to me. So, and often that's discussed in a sort of should way, you should be good to other people. It's like, well, your life is better if you do that. That's a different way of putting it. And you can get people to think about that. It's like, well, remember those times when people were particularly happy with something that you did, something for them. How did you feel about that? Well, you can figure that out for yourself. Maybe it didn't matter, but probably it mattered. Probably you'd like to have that happen a lot more.
But I think even more so, the feeling that you get when you have a responsibility and you deliver on it. Mm-hmm. I think that, for me, that feels even more meaningful, that you uphold your end of the bargain, that you make someone's life better. That feels even better than when someone says, thank you for that. Thank you for doing that.
Mm-hmm. Right. No, absolutely. No, I wasn't thinking so much about the consequences of the thanks. Yeah. That's just an indication that you did something, that was productive and useful and caring, let's say. And And I think people know that too, that when they're operating properly, parents find tremendous meaning in the service they provide to their children, obviously. And I think you find that within a relationship, what you give, I mean, it's reciprocal, obviously. There has to be reciprocity, but it's better to concentrate at least half the time on what you're giving.
Right.
One of the real advantages, I think a lot of the current political movements are quasi-religions, essentially. And religious structures have collapsed very badly. And so these things arise to take their place. because we need a religious structure, because that's what provides us with our fundamental story. The fundamental story of life is a religious story, by definition. That's what I mean by that. Is the most fundamental story you have is the closest thing you have to a religion. So
we started there. I mean, we started with the stories.
Yes. Well, and metaphysics be damned, but I don't know what the fundamental significance of consciousness is, so, and neither does anybody else. So there's plenty of room for metaphysical speculation. It's hard to know what each person's destiny is, but in any case, the problem with so many ideological stories is that they give you an easy enemy. And that's extremely dangerous. And maybe the enemy, they always give you an enemy. Yeah, that's a real problem.
So that seems like one of the biggest problems, is there's always an enemy.
Well, the biggest problem is the enemy isn't you. You're your worst enemy.
I agree.
That's the right place to start. And so, one of the advantages, I think, of Christianity, although I don't think it's limited to Christianity, is that it insists that that's the battleground. You. Right? And so if you need an enemy, and maybe you do, look within. We live inside a damaged structure, and we also bear responsibility for that damage because we don't do everything we can to constantly repair it. And you might say, well, that's actually one of the fundamental, people say, well, what's the meaning of life? What they really mean is, what's the positive meaning of life? Because as we've already discussed, the negative meanings of life are more or less self-evident. Well, the positive meaning of life is to be found in noting the state of lack of repair of the walled city that you inhabit, and then sallying forth to do something about that, to repair the breaches and to fix up the walls and to make the structure that you inhabit as secure and as productive as it possibly can be. And there's no shortage of opportunities to do that. You can do that in your own mind, you can do that in your own room, you can do that in your own household, in your local community. And maybe if you get good at doing it at all those levels, then you can start to look beyond that. And so there's challenges. That's the thing that's kind of interesting about this insufficient structure, is that it has a set of challenges built into it because of its insufficiency, and perhaps even because of its corrupt nature, that calls forth the potential response from you of heroic adventure. And the heroic adventure is to man the barricades and repair the city. And you can always do that. It doesn't matter what your personal circumstances are. There's always something that isn't right near you, isn't correct, isn't laid out properly, that you could just fix if you wanted to. And one of the things that we're going to talk about tonight is the idea that if you adopt an attitude that's like that the role that you should play is to make things better wherever you are, however you can, that what would actually happen would be that things would get better wherever you are in all sorts of ways, and that we've really, as a species, you might say, or maybe even as singular individuals, we've explored that rarely. It isn't something that's put forth as a proposition that often, and it's quite surprising to me. And I had an interesting experience the other day. I went to the keg. I go there because I have food allergies, and they're very careful with people who have food allergies. And the waiter took me to the table, and he said that he had been watching my lectures, and that's a very common experience. And he was happy about that, and he said that he'd had 2 promotions at the keg in the last 4 months because he'd been watching my lectures. And I really found that an affecting experience, because you might say, well, he's working as a waiter at the keg and there's nothing particularly heroic about that, and I disagree with that, actually, because I don't care where you're located, you can do a hell of a job, and I mean that literally. At whatever job you have, you can take whatever job you have and you can make it a real nice little piece of absolute misery. Or you can act like a civilized human being and notice that no matter where you are, there's a richness and a complexity that's completely inexhaustible right at hand. And then you can take that seriously and you can say, well, I happen to be a waiter at the Keg, and perhaps that's not what I expected, and he's a young guy, and perhaps that isn't where I want to end up, but it's not nothing. It's a rich environment, and I can make it a lot better if I want to. I can get along properly with my coworkers and not gossip behind their back, and I can treat my customers properly, and if an opportunity comes my way, I can take it, and I can see what happens. And so he said that's what he had started doing, and that things were working out much better for him. He was in a much better job than he was 3 months ago. And 3 months, that's nothing, right? I mean, that's a nice trajectory. It's an uphill trajectory, and that's what you want, really. An uphill trajectory is actually even better than being somewhere good, as far as I'm concerned, because one of the things that really makes your life meaningful is the clear realization that you're headed somewhere better than you are now. And then it's even better if you also understand that there's a direct causal relationship between the things that you're doing and the steepness of that incline. And so I get a lot of letters from people like that, and they're most frequently young men, although not always. And they say, well, you know, I've been listening to these lectures and I decided that I'm going to try to take responsibility for my life, and so I've started to stop doing all the stupid things that I know that are stupid, that I know I shouldn't be doing, and I've started doing some of the things that aren't stupid that I know I should be doing, which seems pretty obvious, really, if you think about it. But obvious though it may be, that isn't necessarily what people do. And then they write and say, you can't believe what difference that makes, and they're thrilled about it. And so I'm thrilled about it when I get letters like that, because I really don't experience anything as better than a letter like that or a message like that, because it's so good to see things that aren't so good replaced by something better. And I really do think it's an open question. I truly believe it's an open question to what degree we could make things better if that's what we actually aimed at doing.
But if you were to pick, 3 rules for life that would lead you down a better path, what would they be?
Well, I think not saying things you know to be untrue. That's a good thing. Don't lie. That's good. Be grateful. And then try to work for the best in yourself and other people. And maybe even broader than that. Try to work for the best, despite your cynicism and resentment. I suppose that's a form of gratitude as well. That's what love means, fundamentally, is working for the best of things. And it's a goal. I mean, what's the alternative? Hate? And that's not going to make things better. It's going to make things worse. Generally speaking. So something like truth nested inside of love. Then there's gratitude lurking around the edges. Beauty is important.
More art, right?
Yeah, well, more beauty, period. Everywhere. That would be nice. It's kind of intimidating, beauty.
What do you mean? What do you mean by that?
Well, because it's an ideal. It judges you. This is something that's quite interesting, is every ideal is a judge. Right? Because
by
you
nature.
fall short of it. Yeah, but it's an interesting problem that you need an ideal to work towards, but the consequence of that is that you're judged by it.
That's fascinating, because we always want the ideal, right?
Yeah, well, I recommend it to people that they try to reward themselves for improving over who they were yesterday, rather than punishing themselves for their deviation from the ideal. Look for incremental improvements and let yourself know that you've managed them.
Is it important to hold the ideal, but also then keep short-term goals of
yes,
you
definitely.
Against yourself?
Yes, definitely. Yeah, you want to break it down into, and you do this with kids too. You want to set someone a task that will stretch them beyond their limit, but not be impossible, right? So that's part of being intelligent and careful within a relationship, because it'd be nice to facilitate success. I mean, maybe it has to be punctuated by failure from time to time, but that's one of the things you do as a therapist, is try to set things up so that people succeed in moving towards their goals, and try to make the tasks small enough so that they're a reasonable probability that they will be completed successfully. The other thing that happens in the future authoring exercise is that you're asked to articulate the reasons for all the goals that come out of your vision of the future. So you're asked, like, why would it be good for you? Why would it be good for your family? Why would it be good for broader society? So that gives you 3 levels of argumentation right there. And if you have it articulated down into detail and it's related to other important goals, then you're a hell of a thing to argue with, because people just aren't that deep, by which I mean they just don't have that many levels of explanation or objection. And it's also really useful in relationship to your own mind, because if you want to do something that's difficult and that requires energy, a lot of different subsystems in your mind are going to throw up objections. It's like, well, maybe that isn't what you should be doing right now. Maybe you should be doing the dishes or vacuuming or watching TV or looking at YouTube. Or if you're really sneaky, when you're trying to do something hard, what your brain does is give you something else hard to do that's not quite as hard, so that you can feel justified in not doing the thing you're supposed to because you're doing something else useful. And if you give in to that temptation, which you often will, then it wins, and because it wins, it gets a little dopamine kick and it grows stronger. Anything you let win, the internal argument, grows. And anything you let be defeated shrinks, because it's punished. It doesn't get to have its way. So that's another thing really to remember, is don't practice what you do not want to become. And because they're neurological circuits, you build those things in there, man, they're not going anywhere. You can build another little machine to inhibit them. That's the best you can do. Once they're in there, you can't get them out. And then the ones you build to inhibit can be taken out by stress, and the old habits will come back up. So you got to be careful what you say and what you do, because you build yourself that way. If you can communicate in those means, speaking, writing, and if you can think, you are so powerful that nothing can stop you. You think about it, well, what do you mean? Well, I don't care who you are. I don't care if you're a plumber or a waitress. Not that there's anything wrong with being a plumber or a waitress, because there isn't. It's like, you're going to negotiate for a raise, you're going to negotiate for a promotion, you're going to negotiate how your customers treat you, you're going to negotiate how you advertise yourself, for example, with regards to picking up customers. That's all articulated linguistic ability, the ability to express yourself. If you're good at that, you win, period. And so, right, look, there's a reason, like the children of rich people took liberal arts degrees. Why? Because the rich knew that was the best possible training for leadership positions. And it wasn't because it was a romp through the park for 4 years and then daddy's inheritance. It was because if you learned how to communicate, you were unstoppable. You can accomplish what you want to accomplish if you're being wise about it, by being eminently reasonable. That's the thing, is you can have reason on your side, and I mean reason in the best possible sense. It's like you don't have to be temperamental and impulsive in this sort of situation. You can try to put yourself together, which I would highly recommend, and then you can lay yourself open to the attacks. Now that means you should be able to defend yourself. You should have the articulated structures at hand. You should orient yourself properly, politically and philosophically, and even physically for that matter, so that you're a force to contend with. But once you have that down, then you play it with the lightest possible hand. And that way also you have the highest probability of let's say, of changing the minds of people who are possessed by an ideology so that they can rejoin the productive political dialogue. And that's what you want. You don't want to defeat them. First of all, good luck with that. It's like, well, you've got to live with them. You can't defeat people that you live with, because there they are the next day. And if you defeat them, well, then they're defeated. And maybe that's not for the best. And second, it's not like they're happy about the fact that they're defeated. It's not like they're not going to be waiting around to find out when they can defeat you next. It's like if you're married to someone, think, well, I won that argument. It's like, no, you didn't. No, you didn't, because there that person is, waking up next to you the next day. And so if you won, and they're defeated, and humiliated because of it, then the probability that they're going to react properly to you if they have any sense at all is very low. And so what you want is you want to negotiate your way to a sustainable peace. And that's what you want to do in the political realm too, because, well, in this country, you know, there's a certain amount of polarization. I don't think it's anywhere near as bad as the media is making it out to be as they go through their death spirals and generate clickbait like mad. Because, you know, in the US, you guys have been voting 50% Republican and 50% Democrat for what, about 20 years, right down the middle. It hasn't changed that much. But these people who are on the opposite side of the political spectrum from you, they're the people who live across the street. They're the people who live down the street. They're family members, for that matter. And you're going to have to live with them. It's like you don't want to defeat them. You want to bring them back into the reasonable political dialogue. And you do that by having a certain amount, first of all, by getting your act together so that you're a credible and admirable person. But then by having some forbearance and negotiating towards peace.
If you could give one advice to us, how we could be able to actually put our opinion out there and to actually make people listen and not to cause some mindless conflict with just yelling, what advice would you give us?
Learn to write. I'm dead serious. Like, I'm dead serious about that. Because writing is formalized thinking. And so the way you write is, first of all, you need a problem. Because why write if you don't have a problem? So this is good advice if you're just writing an essay, by the way, for your classes. It's like, pick a bloody problem that you want to write about, because otherwise it's false right from the start. It's up to you to engage with the material until you find something that grips you, that you desire to investigate. Okay, so you need a problem. Well, the next thing you need to do is, well, you need to have something to say about the problem. Well, so reading is really good for that. Read as much as you can, get your hands on that addresses the problem. Okay, so now you know a bunch of things, or at least provisionally know them. You at least have access to them. Well, now you start sorting through it. It's like, okay, well, maybe I need to summarize what I've learned, and then I need to iron out the contradictions between what I've learned, and I need to elegantly formulate that, and I need to get my word choice right, and my phrase choice right, and my sentence choice right, and I need to organize the sentences into proper paragraphs, and the paragraphs into proper sequence so that I have a coherent argument. And at the same time, what you're doing is you're integrating your own personality at the highest and most abstract level of organization. And you're sharpening your tools, and you're putting yourself straight because you're learning to think. You learn to do that by writing. And so I would say, pick some hard problems and learn to write very, very carefully. And when I say pay attention to the word, I mean that. Pick the right words. Organize them into the right phrases. Get your sentences straight. Like when I wrote my first book, Maps of Meaning, I believe I wrote every sentence in that book 50 times. 50 variants of every sentence. I'd read it once, I'd read it again, I'd read it again, I'd read it again, and I'd have a little competition. Which sentence is better? Which sentence is better? I'd pick that sentence. Do the same with the paragraphs. Over many, many years, you hone your words. They're the most powerful thing about you, bar none. If you are an effective writer and speaker and communicator, you have all the authority and competence that there is. And so you're at university. Maybe you're taking a humanities degree. Well, what's the humanities degree for? It's to teach you how to think. You learn to think by writing. Now there's more to read, to speak, and all of that, but the best thing you can do is read and write every day, a couple of hours every day. Write about things you find important, and see if you can discover what you believe to be true. And that'll build you a foundation. And it's unbelievably practical. Like if you look at people who are phenomenally successful across life, there's various reasons, but one of them is that they're unbelievably good at articulating what they're aiming at, and strategizing and negotiating and enticing people with a vision forward.
It's like, get your words together, man. That makes you unstoppable. And that's the core of the humanities, that idea. Get your words together. Make yourself an articulate creature, and then you're deadly in the best possible way. So, and take that seriously. And I'll end with something too. You students, you might think in your more cynical moments that you have to offer your professors what they want and gerrymander the content of your language to suit their predilections, or what you consider to be their predilections. First of all, it's a very small minority of professors who are corrupt enough to punish you for producing a high-quality essay that they don't agree with. And though that's reprehensible, but it doesn't happen very often. But more importantly, it's the highest academic sin to do that. Because what you're here to do is to learn to find your true voice. And every time you deviate from that for expedient reasons, you corrupt yourself. And not in a trivial way. Because when you formulate your arguments, that becomes a permanent part of your character. You carry that with you. It becomes part of the structure through which you view the world, and it guides your actions. And so you hold your words pristine, and you work in a dedicated way to become as articulate and clear as you can possibly become. And there's nothing that's more practical and noble than that at the same time. That's why the humanities are so valuable. You think, well, what good is a humanities degree? It's like, well, you come out of here able to speak and think and write, no matter where you go, like you're headed for the pinnacle, and hopefully in a way that's positive for everyone. So there's a New Testament idea that you should turn the other cheek, and that's a very tough one to contend with, because it's not easy to separate out that from the appearance of weakness, let's say, because you want to be able to stand up and defend yourself. Obviously, there's no credibility unless you're capable of doing that. You have no credibility unless you're capable of doing that. In the interview that you're referring to, I attempted to use minimal necessary force, and all I was doing was deflecting accusations that, as far as I was concerned, had nothing to do with me. And the reason that was successful was exactly because there was no obliteration. There was just stepping back, say, well, that's not accurate the way that you're formulating that. And what happened was that she had to show her hand, and it was her showing her hand that produced the consequences that were associated with that video, which I think has been viewed, the video itself, about 11 million times, and the various clips and cuts is probably 50 million by now. But because I didn't use force or any more than was necessary, then she had to keep stepping forward with her accusations and her ideology, and she just laid it out completely so that everyone could see it. And so it's another thing you really want to think about. Like, you don't want to be thinking about this as a polarized political battle, because you're in the damn polarized political battle, and it's actually the polarized political battle that's the problem. Now, now it's not like, as I said already, it's not like you want to be a pushover, but you step away from that and you work on yourself so that you're an increasingly powerful person. But one of the ways that you do that is that you learn to use minimal necessary force. It's like you don't defend yourself any more than you have to. Like, be careful. Don't push any harder than you need to, because all you do is you generate a counterforce by pushing harder than you need to, and then you're in conflict. So there are constraints on how you can interact with the world in a successful manner. Let's assume that you don't want undue pain and anxiety. We could just start with that, and I think that's a reasonable proposition. You could tolerate some pain and anxiety if it's in the service of something greater, obviously, but I just mean pointless pain and anxiety. We don't want any more of that than is necessary, and that means that you have to take care of yourself to some degree, but the manner in which you take care of yourself is severely constrained. This is partly why you have to be intelligent and careful and plot your way through life properly. You have to take care of yourself today, but you have to take care of yourself today in a way that doesn't interfere with you taking care of yourself tomorrow, and next week, and next month, and next year, and 5 years from now, and 10 years from now. So you can't do just what you want to in the next hour, because if it's impulsive pleasure seeking, let's say, something like that, excess alcohol use or excess drug use or careless sexual behavior or betrayal of people to gain you something in the moment, you're going to pay for that. You're going to pay for it tomorrow. You're going to pay for it next week and next month and next year. And so because you're going to exist in the future and because you have to live with yourself, there's only a certain number of ways that you can act that are going to work. But it's more than that. It's not just that you're responsible to your future self or the set of all your future selves, is that you also have to act in a way that works for your family. Because otherwise your family is going to disintegrate and break down and cause you and them all sorts of misery and grief. And not just your family now, but also your family into the future. And then not just your family either, but also your community. And so you have to set your aspirations so that they serve you in the broadest sense over a long period of time, and they also serve your family and they also serve your community, and that's a very tight set of constraints. And I think that the best solution to that set of constraints from a philosophical perspective, or maybe even a theological perspective, is to view the world as a place not of groups but of individuals, of sovereign individuals who are responsible for their destinies, responsible for their families and for their communities. And that's essentially the ethos of the modern West, because the thing that's so remarkable about the West, I would say, is that we did a wonderful job of articulating out the idea of individual sovereignty, and we made that the cornerstone of our political and economic systems. And the thing about that is, it works. And the evidence that it works is, well, it's right here in this room. Everything in this room is working, right? And around the world, increasingly, people are becoming economically better off at a rate that's absolutely staggering. And a huge portion of that is because we've articulated out the ethos of the responsible sovereign individual. And that's not the same as the individual with rights. It's not like rights are irrelevant, but rights are really there to facilitate your adoption of individual responsibility. And one of the things I would like to say to all of you, and it's one of the things I really wanted to talk about coming here today when I was thinking about it, is that you don't want to play identity politics. And that can happen because it can be played on the right and the left, right? And that's a collectivist idea. You don't want to do that. What you could bring to the table that hasn't been brought to the table for years is an emphasis on individual responsibility. And the right way to do that, as far as I'm concerned, is to start with yourselves, is develop a vision for your life. You start to think about, if you could be who you could be, what would that look like? That's the beginning of a mature philosophy of being. If you could be the person that you would admire, who would that person be? How would you configure yourself? How would you configure your career, your education, your family, the use of time outside of work? If you wanted to be the noblest person that you could be, who was adopting the maximal amount of responsibility, how would that look? Then you need a strategy to put that into place. And that's the way you change things properly, and also the way you do the least amount of harm while you're changing. Life has a tragic element, because we're vulnerable, all of us, and we know it, which is the particularly human curse, let's say. We're aware of our vulnerability, and it's not just vulnerability in the tragic sense, it's also the human proclivity for evil that makes the tragedy of life even worse than it would otherwise have to be. And you could say that that's a basic truth. You could even say that that's a basic truth with regards to the meaning of life. It's a pessimistic way of looking at it in some sense, but it leads to an optimistic conclusion. All of us have to face our limitations and malevolence in the world, and the possibility that we'll be betrayed or betray other people and act improperly. And that's a heavy burden, but the truth of the matter is, as far as I'm concerned, that each of us has enough potential character, power of character, let's say, if it's properly manifested, to contend with that in a noble way and to rise above it and to transcend and to deal with it in large part, because we can make the world a much better place than it is for each of us individually and for our families and for our community. And we can constrain the malevolence, at least in our own hearts, and perhaps have a positive effect on those around us as a consequence. And that actually does make things better, and we actually can do that. And that's where the meaning in life is to be found. And that meaning, that goes along with the adoption of that kind of responsibility, is actually the antidote to the suffering. You know that perfectly well, because all of you need a reason to get out of bed in the morning.
especially on a rough morning, you know, when things aren't going so well in your life. And there will be plenty of times when things aren't going so well in your life. And you still need a reason to get up and get moving and get out there. And if you have adopted the responsibility at an individual level to make things better, given how bad they are, if you've adopted the responsibility to make things better, then you have a reason to get up. And so one of the things that I've been stressing to people is that there's very little difference between the meaning in life that gives you fulfillment and that engages you in existence and the willingness to shoulder as much individual responsibility as you can possibly handle. Those are the same things. And that's a really useful thing to know. And you kind of know this, right? Everybody knows this because, first of all, if you're not living up to your responsibilities, even to take care of yourself, the probability that you're going to be ashamed of that at some level is extraordinarily high. And so your own soul tells you that you're in error, so to speak. But also if you look at who you spontaneously admire, which is a good indication of where your value system really sits, you'll see that the people you admire are always people who take responsibility for themselves and responsibility for their family and responsibility for their community. You know, we're cynically, it's often considered that we admire, let's say, the rich and successful because of their status and their wealth and their power. But that's a very shallow and it's very trivial, and I also don't really believe that it's true. I think that the people we admire are people who conduct themselves admirably in life. And you get a spontaneous admiration as a consequence of that. And that's a call from the deepest reaches of your being to imitate and to follow in that pathway. And you can do that. And so you need a meaning to offset the tragedy of life. Otherwise you just suffer stupidly, and you tend to make people around you suffer the same way. And the way that you find that meaning is by adopting as much responsibility as you can. And what's also so fascinating about that is, you know, you're characterized by an indefinite potential. And it isn't easy to understand exactly what that is, that potential, but you know, it's what people call you on when they say, you know, you're not living up to your potential, whatever that is. That potential will be called forth from you as a consequence of adoption of responsibility, because it won't manifest itself unless you take on a load. You're not going to develop in all the ways you could develop unless you set yourself a serious challenge, because it takes the challenge to pull that out of you and also to motivate you to rid yourself of all the weaknesses and personality flaws that you've accumulated across the years, and to let those disappear and burn off you. You need to load yourself up before the demands of life will be such that you will discipline yourself properly. And a noble goal is a very good way of beginning that. Get your act together. You've got things to do in the world. The absence of your full being in the world leaves a hole that is filled by terrible things. At minimum, you have an ethical responsibility to ensure that the world doesn't devolve into something approximating hell. And at maximum, you have the responsibility, again, and it's a heavy ethical responsibility, to do everything that's in your power to make things as good as you can possibly make them, in this sophisticated manner that takes you and your family and your community into account. And it's on you, right? And that's meaning. You know, people say, well, I'd like to have a meaningful life. It's like, well, fair enough, but the price that you pay for the meaning that transcends tragedy is the adoption of responsibility for the catastrophe of existence. But that ennobles you, right? It makes you into someone strong and someone competent and someone who's worthwhile and who lives in a manner that justifies their own suffering. And that's there's nothing better than you could possibly do than that.